Welcome to Clause 8, presented by TradeSpace, where the voices of IP come together to talk about the forces shaping the industry today. If you enjoy this show, please subscribe on clause8podcast.com for updates and wherever you listen to your podcasts. While you're there, don't forget to give it a 5-star review. Today's episode is with the Chief IP Counsel of the Dana Farber Cancer Institute, Steve Caltrider. Steve has over 35 years of experience at Eli Lilly, where he rose to the role of General Patent Counsel. Steve brings a wealth of knowledge to the table about the patent strategies that the most sophisticated companies in the pharmaceutical space use to protect their most important assets. He also served on the USPTO's Public Patent Advisory Committee and is now the chair of the ABA's section of IP. In this episode, Steve discusses the importance of IP in bringing medical innovations to patients, and he shares what keeps him up at night.
I've already had partners tell us, I'm willing to sponsor your research, I'm willing to help fund your research, but it can't have any federally funded funding associated with it. Well, that could be catastrophic to us.
And now, here's your host, Eli Mauser.
Steve, thank you so much for joining Clause 8.
Thank you for having me.
So I know some other people in the IP field and on the PPAC. When I told them that I was interviewing you, they got very excited. They had nothing but positive things to say. And it's publicly available that you've been a champion for innovation in IP, not only for the companies that you worked for, but for that in general. So I'm excited to talk to you and about all the roles you've been in and what you've seen from that vantage point. I want to start with your current role at the Dana Farber Cancer Institute. Can you tell us a little bit about what is it and what is the role of IP there?
Sure. The Dana Farber Cancer Institute is an academic research hospital. It really has a dual mission. The first mission is its hospital mission to provide expert, compassionate, and equitable care to its patients that visit. That's the children, the adults, and the families that are suffering, members of the families are suffering from cancer. The second is to advance the understanding, the diagnosis, treatment, and care of patients. And that's really where I come in. It's a tremendous amount of research that occurs at the hospital. It's cutting edge, and the way for that research to reach patients at scale is through IP. We procure the patents that then we can license to other companies and other entities to actually develop it and commercialize it at scale. Otherwise, the research will never get to patients.
When you think about what is the IP that is necessary to obtain to do that, how do you think about that at a high level?
It's what's going to become the next drug or the next treatment for cancer or the next diagnosis, if it's a diagnosis, innovation. And so we really look to understand what that innovation is, how it will be delivered to patients. So if it's a small molecule drug, that's very easy. If they discover a small molecule drug at the institute, we patent the small molecule, then we license that to a commercialization partner who will develop it and advance it through the FDA and regulatory processes to reach patients. If it's a method of diagnosis, it's much the similar path. The technology is a bit different in terms of what it goes into the patent for the patent protection, but it's the same principle at a high level. We take the innovation, we understand how is this going to reach patients, what product or method or service is going to be rendered so that it can help and benefit patients, and how do we protect that?
So you mentioned that the reason that DFCI, I guess, obtains IP protection is so that you can provide the benefits of the research at scale to patients, but why not just give it away for free and then everybody can run with it and provide it to as many patients as possible around the world based on what you guys come up with?
It doesn't work that way. The best way to get innovation to patients is through the patent system. And that's the proven method for decades, if not centuries, in terms of how to get innovation to any type of innovation to commercialization. If we discover a new drug, we can publish on the new drug and no one's going to take it because it's not going to be regulatory approved. Without somebody making the investment necessary to advance it through clinical trials, to do those studies, it's roughly $1 billion to develop that drug and actually make it accessible as to patients as a drug. And no one's going to make that investment without IP. So our role at the Institute is to make that discovery. My role at the Institute is to protect that discovery so that somebody will make that investment. Because without the investment, it's just going to sit in the laboratory and it's not going to go anywhere and it won't reach patients.
So I imagine for somebody to make that high-level investment, you said billions of dollars, They not only need to have IP, but they need to have faith that it is bulletproof. What do you do to guarantee billions of dollars investments? I mean, what do you do when you're obtaining those patents to kind of make sure that is the case?
It's a great question, and I'll just it is the $1 million question, if you will, because the patent right has to be reliable and durable, and that's certainly one of the reasons I've engaged at Dana Farber to procure those patents that are reliable and durable. It's one of the reasons I do the policy work that I do. It's one of the reasons that I'm very engaged in the patent system as a kind of a true believer in the model. You pay close attention to the facts and the law, and you draft patents that will withstand the scrutiny that they will be exposed to down the road. One of the key elements of the system is when you are successful, people will challenge those patents, and you have to be prepared to defend those patents and make sure they're compliant with the statutory requirements of novelty, non-obviousness, and disclosure. And you draft the patent with the end in mind that you have to survive the scrutiny that it'll face down the road. And when you procure a good patent, the system works. If you try to procure a patent that can't withstand that scrutiny, then the likelihood is you aren't going to get the investment. You're going to end up in trouble.
Obviously, there's been a lot of different changes that have happened over your career. Is there anything that you're doing now in terms of obtaining patent protection in your field that might be different from what you did in the beginning?
Oh, sure. No, it's changed dramatically. Of course, the American Invents Act changed it from how the term is measured, even in terms of 20-year term from filing versus 17 years from issuance. That was a significant change in the pharmaceutical industry and the pharmaceutical practice, or practice in life sciences in general. The current Section 101 issues, you have to really have top of mind, particularly if you're working on diagnostic innovation. But unfortunately, it's going into other areas of the law around gene therapy, cell therapy. There's other areas that are now being impacted by Section 101 that you really have to have top of mind. What scope of claim you're entitled to? If you have a breakthrough innovation, as we do at the Institute, how do you fairly protect that innovation? And what's a fair measure of scope? The Amgen case is really brought a lot of attention to that issue on what is a fair measure of scope, and how do you describe and enable that claim around that fair measure of scope. The transparency of the patent system. When I first got into the business, patents didn't publish until they issued, and now they published 18 months. That's a good thing, and it brings much more transparency to the system. That was an adjustment in practice. So the practice in the space evolves over time, as it should, as the law and the technology and the innovation develops. Biotech was in its infancy when I started practicing, and now it's a massive percentage of pharmaceutical products in development are in the bioproduct space.
You mentioned the Section 101 patent eligibility, how that impacted different areas in your field. Does that have an impact in the areas that DFCI decides to invest in research and so forth? Or have you found ways around that?
It has a very, very significant impact. And unfortunately for patients, it's an impact that's not very favorable, in the sense that it's very, very difficult to find a commercial partner for diagnostics at the moment. There's just not a lot of interest given the state of law. It's very difficult to get a claim that you're going to have confidence in, that the court will uphold and track that investment. I think one of the judges in an opinion indicated that the Federal Circuit hadn't upheld at that point in time a diagnostic patent that would reach the court. And that's just very daunting. So it presents significant challenges. It's an area of very, very important research. If you can identify the patients that will respond to the medication, you obviously avoid side effects, avoid unintended consequence of a patient taking that medicine who's not going to be responsive. I mean, where you don't want to be, both from a kind of a payer perspective as well as from a patient perspective, is take a drug that may have side effects, pay for the drug that may have side effects, and not have any benefit from it. You're a non-responder. And diagnostics kind of are the key to identify the responders from the non-responders. And it's really quite unfortunate that the patent system is kind of acting as a counterweight. The Moonshot Initiative, the Cancer Moonshot Initiative, is focused on diagnostics. A lot of research is being focused on diagnostics, and the patent system's kind of a point of tension with that because of the difficulties on Section 101 to get meaningful protection on diagnostics.
So it's interesting. You're saying that, there could be investment made in areas to find out whether patients need the drugs that are being prescribed to them. But because of the state of the patent system, these patients are just taking these drugs. So in fact, it might be the area for reducing drug prices. That might be an area where that might actually help.
Well, I don't want to overstate it because the investment is not what it should be. And the impact of the investment being not what it should be is that you aren't developing diagnostics that could identify the patients that will respond over the patients that don't respond. And so it is a cost issue because patients, if you administer the drug to all comers, you'll spend more than just administering the drug to those that will respond to the drug. And everybody's interest is you want people to respond to the medicine to get healthy.
So you mentioned DFCI depends a lot on the grants and so forth. I think a lot of those come from the government. Previously, you were at Eli Lilly. How's it being different at DFCI versus being at Eli Lilly, which is obviously a big pharmaceutical company?
No, it's tremendously different. Dana Farber is a nonprofit cancer research hospital, it's an academic hospital. So there is a great deal of premium put on publication. And that publication premium is that if researchers need to publish in order to help justify and help secure grants, and the grants support their research. So unlike a for-profit pharmaceutical company where they reinvest sales revenue into research, generally on the order of 15 to 20% of their revenue is driven back into research. Dana Farber doesn't work that way. We don't have a revenue stream that we're taking a portion of or a percentage of and putting it into research. The research is funded by grants and donations and licensing revenue. It's not funded by hospital revenue. And because of that, there's a premium on securing grants. And to secure grants, publications are a key part of that. You hear academics say publications are their currency. When I was in private practice at Eli Lilly and Company, I didn't really understand that so much. When I'm in practice at Dana Farber, I understand that because without the publications, they don't get grants. Without grants, they can't fund their research. So it's kind of a cycle. And we have to live within that cycle. The IP is important. The institutions relying on it to get their innovation to patients. But you have this counterbalance that you have to also acknowledge that it's an academic research institution where publications are really their currency to get grants and get funding to further their research. So you have a bit of more of a tension there that you have to manage at Dana Farber, where at Lilly, everybody understood that IP was the key to getting the product commercialized, and it kind of took priority, if you will. At Dana Farber, publication, I would say, takes at least an equal priority, if not a slightly higher priority. Then I have to work within that framework to secure the IP to allow it to be commercialized.
One thing I just want to highlight, and let me know if my understanding is correct, from DFCI's perspective, the reason the IP and the patents are important is not because of the revenue stream, but it's mostly to get those commercial partners to commit to making this widely available to patients.
Absolutely. In fact, we aren't a very attractive partner if we demand too much of that revenue. We aren't going to get rich doing that. We're hoping to cover our cost and get a modest royalty to help fund additional research. But we recognize our commercial partners, they're the for-profit entity in this, and we need to make it attractive to them. Otherwise, they don't want to partner with us.
I want to talk a little bit about your role as Chief IP Counsel. You obviously mentioned some things that you think about and you care about, but on a day-to-day, what is it that you do, and what is your, biggest concern?
Oh, the most important thing and my highest ongoing priority is to procure valid patent rights, reliable and durable patent rights that a licensee would be interested in and taking up. So I spend a great deal of my time and effort thinking about how do we do that at the institution. I do have several issues that keep me up at night. The current discussion around Bidol keeps me up at night. Section 101 keeps me up at night. As I mentioned earlier, the scope of protection that's available in the discovery research phase is something that I think is a pressing issue. So there are issues that kind of underlie that highest priority, which is to procure valid patents. I spend a lot of time working with our tech transfer office at the Institute and a lot of time with prospective licensees or investment groups that are interested in investing in Dana Farber's intellectual property and innovation. So you spend time facilitating the transfer of that technology as well. But the bulk of my time and my highest priority is how do we get a solid patent right out of this innovation, and how do we claim it? And it takes a lot of time, energy, and effort to make sure you get it right.
One of the things you mentioned that keeps you up at night is the current discussion about Bayh-Dole Act, and I think you might be referring to the administration's proposal to actually exercise margin rights. And correct me if I'm wrong, but basically, if the government funds any of the research that DFCI does, later on, if it doesn't think, for example, if the drug prices are too high or something like that, it can just march in and confiscate those IP rights, from what I understand. Why is it keeping you up at night? And then are you seeing any practical impact at this point from your discussions with potential partners and so forth?
Well, it keeps me up at night because a significant percentage of our research is funded by grants. As I mentioned, we don't divert hospital revenue to support research. Research is funded by grants and donations predominantly, and licensee revenue. A very significant percentage of the research at Dana Farber can't continue if you don't secure those grants. Many of those grants are federally funded grants. The problem is partners have no interest in engaging in projects that have federally funded. I'm already having prospective partners tell me that if this project has federal funding, I'm not interested in it. I've already had partners tell us, I'm willing to sponsor your research. I'm willing to help fund your research, but it can't have any federally funded funding associated with it. Well, that can be catastrophic to us. And if we do find a partner that would be willing to take a project that's federally funded with this risk, the amount they're willing to pay for it will be much, much lower than it would be otherwise. So the revenue stream that we do get in licensing revenue will be significantly less, which again undermines the very research that we're trying to advance. We'll go back in time to pre-Bayh-Dole when federally funded research projects kind of rotted on the shelf and they never were taken forward commercially because the dynamic will just kind of undermine the very, very successful benefits of Bayh-Dole, which has been tremendously successful. All the data supports how that act has been transformative for the country, transformative for life science research in particular. And it would be really quite unfortunate to set it back because, in my view, the pharmaceutical players will just stay out of the business. And the consequence of that will be that the academic research centers suffer because we won't be able to bring forward the innovation. We won't be able to find partners.
So it's interesting. Commercial partners are not just seeing it as empty political rhetoric or whatever. They see this as a real possibility of a threat to kind of being exercised.
They're raising it with us in negotiations now. Just the prospect of it happening is enough for them to raise it and say, I'm not interested in this project if it has federally funded funding associated with it.
One thing I was looking at, I don't work in the pharma space, but I was looking at the filings for Eli Lilly, where you were, you spent 35 years. And I was kind of surprised. It's an annual revenue of $30 billion, and they, at least from what I used to get, about 50 applications a year. And it went down from, I guess, 200 in 2008. Did something happen about the way kind of companies like that approach patent filings and so forth? Do you have any insights in that you can share?
Sure. Well, I'll ask, are you a Moneyball fan?
I've heard about it, I could say.
Yeah. Moneyball, of course, I'm referring to the classic movie where they started using data to make informed decisions in the baseball. And I'm a bit of a Moneyball fan, and I'm also a bit of a data and analytics fan. And every Hatch-Waxman case since 1984 has been studied. And when you study every Hatch-Waxman case from 1984, you'll find that there's no correlation between the number of patents that are listed in the Orange Book, which is really the basis for pharmaceutical litigation, and success. So if there's no correlation between the number of patents and success, you quickly realize that you're spending a lot of money unnecessarily, that it only takes a few patents, maybe even just one patent, to keep a market exclusive for a product. And if you start looking at that from a data and analytics perspective, you realize many companies, in my view, are over-investing. And that's the view I took when I was at Eli Lilly. And we, not just me, but myself and my colleagues, recognize that we can invest less and have as good, if not more, success by focusing in on those patents that are really important and not spend the money on those patents that really don't add that much value. I personally don't think that dynamic is completely unique to the pharmaceutical industry. There may be other industries that numbers do matter a bit more, but I think that just looking again at the data, there's a lot of patents that the patent office procures that don't become commercially relevant. And the earlier in time that you sort out those that are relevant from those that don't add that value, the more cost efficient you can be and the more effective you can be. And really make sure the patents you do procure are enforceable and valid and can survive the testing that they'll get when competitors scrutinize them.
Was it hard to make a call like that? You look at the data, you see that it shows something, you believe it, you understand it, but to make that change, it was
really hard. Very hard. The leading indicator or leading metric that people like to use is number of patents. I mean, there's various publications that rank companies by the number of patents. And so I had to explain to business leaders as well as research leadership why being the bottom of that list was okay. And so it was very challenging because that's the easy metric that people gravitate to. Oh, how many patents did you file last year? Oh, we filed 300 or 400. I lead the list, the number of most innovative because I have 500 patents. Well, if you have 499 of them that really don't matter and only one that's important, then should you really be leading the list? But so yes, that was an extraordinarily challenging as General Patent Counsels, that changing course went against the current.
And it's interesting what you're talking about. You looking at the data and seeing that actually getting those key patents is really what's important in the pharma space. You see a lot of criticism about the cost of drug price and so forth, and being blamed on the patent system. And some things you hear as well, these pharma companies are getting all these child applications. They're creating all these patent thickets. And that seems to go against what you're saying actually makes sense to do the strategies. What is a disconnect?
Yeah. I'll start off with, and I'm not a big fan of the term patent thickets. I think it's a little bit of a pejorative, and it's often used in a very misleading way in terms of the discussion. There's a couple of key data points here. The first is, as I mentioned, there's no correlation between market exclusivity and the number of patents. There's examples of one patent holding a market, and there's examples of more patents holding the market, and there's just more is not better. And there's just no data that supports more is better. Secondly, if there's been lots of studies on what's the period of exclusivity for a pharmaceutical product. So from the time of launch until the time a generic drug enters the market, what's that time period? That time period in a couple different studies is somewhere between 12 and 14 years. It's as low as 12 and some change. I don't remember the exact number of months over 12, and it's been short of 14 years. That number has actually declined in the last decade or so, and the reason for that is when Hatch-Waxman came into being and patent term extensions came into being, there was a 14-year cap and a 5-year cap, and trials at that stage in the life sciences and healthcare industry were generally shorter. Approval got in place faster, and the cap that often was hit in PTE was 14 years. And so you had a lot of 14-year product life cycle. Today, whether it's Alzheimer's drug, disease, diabetes, there's a lot of chronic health conditions that require very, very long trials. And so the cap that's most often reached now is the 5-year cap. And so you end up with less than 14 years on many pharmaceutical products now, because the cap doesn't even get you to 14. So that's why that number is trending down, because clinical trials and the regulatory pathway, in my view, is more complicated and a bit longer. So you hit the 5-year cap rather than the 14-year cap. And then on the freedom to operate side, because you also hear patent thickets, being a barrier to entry by competitors, I'm not aware of an instance where a so-called thicket, blocked a competitor. That there are examples of egregious behavior by patent owners with patent misuse and Walker process claims. There's mechanisms in the law to take care of that and capture that and keep people accountable. But for a properly issued, valid patent, whether it's a continuation or whether it's a original application, I'm just not aware of a competitor being blocked. Now, you may have a copier be blocked in terms of a generic competitor. A competitor who wants to design around is generally able to do so, despite what some would call to be there's this patent thicket protecting it. So, I don't think the data necessarily support that. I do think that in instances where there has been excess and patent misuse and inequitable conduct before the office, and where there has been issues, I think the law is in place to address those concerns, take care of those issues. I'm just not seeing, I'm not seeing the data to support patent thickets as being a significant problem.
So you mentioned, I guess, patent term extensions and so forth. We're recording this on April 10th. A couple of weeks ago, the USPTO proposed fees for 2025. And if you look through those proposed fees, the proposal were some crazy increases on things like very obscure kind of fees, but I guess seem to be targeted at pharmaceutical companies. What is going on there, and what are we trying to accomplish, and what's actually going to happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the premise or the theory behind those is if you have a successful patented product, then those fees are affordable to that category of invention, and paying those fees is a reasonable way to help pay for the cost of the patent term extension as well as the underlying patent at the office. The difficulty I have with that, or the concern I have with that, is there's an awful lot of small players. There's a lot of new companies being developed behind a single patent or behind a single innovation, and the affordability of some of those by some of those companies of those fees is difficult and very difficult. They're trying to pay for the massive amount of money required for clinical development and to navigate the regulatory pathway. You layer on top of that patent fees, and it becomes very, very challenging. And I think there's a balance there that you have to manage. Now, your small entity versus your large entity discounts, that's helpful. But I do think that you can put stress in the system where there shouldn't be stress by just getting excessive fees, especially on your small players and your startups and even some of the bigger players. There's companies that develop around a single product, and as that product starts to reach the end of its product life cycle, they are in financial situations where it's also difficult for them to pay those higher fees as well. So I think it's always a trade-off. Obviously, the office needs the resources to fund its operations and do its job well. It's the primary gatekeeper of enforceable and reliable and durable patent rights, and getting it right at the first instance is by far the best place to get it right. So it's a balance, but you have to be mindful, even in the pharmaceutical space, the small player, the entrepreneur, the startup, you can't afford it. You don't want to make the system out of touch or out of reach for a new company.
What do you think will be the practical impact if these companies have to pay?
I don't know that they're so excessive that they'll squeeze people out, but you can get to a point where the fees are such that it becomes a big player market, and that is that the small company either sells themselves or partners up with a bigger player that can afford costs. And I think that would be unfortunate. I mean, if you look at the industry today, there's a number of companies that didn't exist 20 years ago that have made massive impact on patients' lives. So I think the system works best if it's affordable.
You spent 35 years at Eli Lilly. You started there as a patent attorney and you became General Patent Counsel. Can you tell us a little bit about that story and any advice about succeeding like you did in-house?
Yeah, I've been most fortunate and really, really fortunate in my career at Lilly. I decided early on in my career as a scientist that I wasn't necessarily very good at it. So I did two semesters of undergraduate research, and the second semester in particular, the experiments didn't go quite as planned. And I realized that, wow, if I get my PhD and really go into academic research, that it's a tough road. I have a lot of respect for researchers because there's a lot of experiments that don't work. And I had my fair share of experiments that didn't work. So I decided I wanted to be close to the science, and what's the best way to do that? And I was fortunate enough to have a mentor introduce me to patent law and ask me if I'd ever thought about that. And I hadn't.
Do you remember who that mentor was? I always like to, if you have a mentor in mind.
Yeah, I do. His name was Chuck Bruce. He's a long retired attorney who wasn't a patent lawyer, but he was just a good friend of the family. But he was kind enough to invite me down to his firm, which was Barnes and Thornburg, and introduced me to some patent lawyers. So I was really quite fortunate because I had no idea. I mean, I had never been exposed to a patent. I didn't know what a patent was, frankly. And so that I decided that's the best way for me to play my role, that I could work with the scientists and play my part in advancing that science to reach people. At that point in time, I'm not sure I was thinking patients and pharmaceuticals, but I knew that that's what I wanted to do in terms of working with the science, but not necessarily doing the science. From there, I think in-house counsel, in terms of how to be successful in-house, is understand your role and the value you bring. You should have the deepest understanding of the industry, the deep understanding of the business, deep understanding of the people. You are closer to the facts and you're closer to the science than any outside counsel can be. And you need to make sure you leverage that value because that's where you bring to the table. You should have an equal understanding of the law as your outside counsel, but you understand the facts and the people and the science much better than they do. I used to tell people if the flash of genius were really the test for non-obviousness, that I'd be blinded by now, that I've been in the room. It's rewarding to be in the room and see the inventive spirit flowing in the room as the chemists discuss where we are with the molecules and where they want to go next with their experimentations and their studies and the data. And it's incredibly rewarding then to pull that out and convert it to a patent application, file that patent application, see it through prosecution, see the business take it up to terms to develop it into a drug. And in-house counsel, you get to be the eyewitness to that innovation. You know you play your part to convert the innovation to something that will reach patients. So my view, the courtside seat, if you will, of patent practice is in-house. And if you want to do the work more arm's length outside counsel, or frankly, the disadvantage of being in-house is you don't get quite the variety. Now, I've worked on a massively wide array of technologies, but all of the technologies that I've worked with have been in the life sciences and the pharmaceutical space. But for me, I wanted the courtside seat. I wanted to be there and work closely with the scientists and see their energy and their excitement when they have something that they believe in and they think can really transform patients' lives, and then do my part to help them get there and make that so.
So you did become General Patent Counsel, which I think is the equivalent of Chief Patent Counsel in other companies. What was the hardest part in being that role at a company like Eli Lilly?
You're really trying to work through others to do great things. And the most challenging part for me is finding that balance of allowing others to do great things and just enable them by putting in to support the infrastructure to allow them to do great things and do their job and excel. And then stepping back from that and providing the direction and finding the balance between the details and the high level oversight. The most challenging part is finding that sweet spot, putting the right people in place, challenging them to do great things, and in some respect, supporting them, getting out of their way so they can execute.
Another thing you mentioned is working with outside counsel and they have a broader perspective. Is there anything that stands out to you over your years about what outside counsel has done that kind of really impressed you, like how they approached servicing you or made you say, wow?
Yeah, there's a few things. In terms of what I expect from outside counsel, I expect them to know the law inside and out, right? But I think that's table stakes both for inside counsel and outside counsel. And surprisingly, there's people that may not view that the same way, or they get busy and competing priorities are such that they struggle to keep current on the law. The second thing is I look for outside counsel to be appropriately creative and appropriately aggressive, to help me think outside of the box at times. How are we going to deal with this, this tricky issue? If the issue were straightforward, I'd just do it myself. And so I look for kind of a creativity or an aggressiveness that helps me think differently about the issue than I might otherwise think about it. And the third thing I look for is a counsel that treats their in-house counsel as an equal partner. It's kind of amazing. Before I became General Patent Counsel at Lilly, I led their IP litigation team. And the number of outside counsel that we would bring in when we were considering outside counsel for a case that would try to teach us about a Lilly case. It's like, well, you do recognize Lilly's a party to that case, and you do recognize that was my case. And, you don't really need to explain to me what that case is all about because I lived it for a number of years. But the counselor comes in and appreciates that our understanding is one of partnership, that I'm not a business person that's coming into this arrangement that may not have the same understanding of the law as they do. Now, there may be things that I'm not as deep on, and maybe so I don't want to suggest that, each side is not bringing a nuance or an understanding of a nuance that the other side doesn't have, but we have to treat each other as that we're coming into it as equal contributors on the law.
In terms of creativity, is there any examples or anything that kind of stands out to you over the years?
Well, I can share an example in the litigation context as well as in the prosecution context. In the litigation context, it had a case that you look at the patent and there were some serious prior art issues, some very serious Section 112 issues. And so my perspective as an in-house lawyer, I was really focused in on developing strong arguments against those positions and go to outside counsel and they look at it and recognize that there could be a standing issue, that the inventors had moved from one institution to another institution right around the filing date and said, I'm not sure this institution owns what they purport to own. And because the invention had been made at the prior employer rather than the employer that was asserting the patent against us. And I'm also of the mindset that you have to prioritize and you have to focus on whether it's what patents you file or what art issues you develop in litigation, that a scorched earth strategy of investigating everything may lead you nowhere because you aren't focusing in on what really can make a difference in a case. And so my initial reaction to that was, hey, we got some really good arguments here. Why in the world do we want to chase a standing issue that doesn't look like it'll have legs? And creative counsel said, no, let's think about this. Let's see how we can develop it. And, ended up being the winner for us. So we actually got an early out on that case because of a lack of standing and never reached the substantive issues. The procurement example is, it's more recent in the sense that, post Amgen, what claim is going to be entitled to scope and how much claim scope can you get and how do you support a claim, particularly in the early discovery phase. My own view is Section 112F was put in place for this very reason, albeit it's only been applied predominantly in the mechanical arts, more so. But Halliburton Oil was a case that the response to that case was putting in 112F to provide for claim scope to a functional claim. And so creative counsel will look at that and say, how can we craft a claim invoking 112F and position us for success to get some reasonable scope on some innovation? It's untested. At least I'm not aware of any authority yet on how those claims will be viewed. But post Amgen, I think you need to put your creative thinking caps on and figure that out. And so I've had a lot of conversations with outside counsel on how best to do that.
Great example. And I think the latter is almost the best practice, I think, because Tom Irving mentioned it as well. So I think.
No. Tom's been pretty vocal in that space. As is Dana Farber. We have too.
One of the things, and obviously this is how I first heard about you, is your involvement in some of these patent policy debates. You've written about the reason you got involved in the ABA in the first place is because you were interested in some of these issues, and this was back towards the beginning of your career. I meet a lot of prosecution attorneys and litigation attorneys and their attitude towards policy is like, well, that doesn't really concern me. My job is to get patents or to litigate patents, and I'll figure out how to do that and make money on that. I'm guessing you might differ from that, and I guess I kind of want to know the relevance of policy to all patent attorneys, or maybe it isn't, I guess.
No, that's a great question. I'll start off with first, and I've said this already, I believe that I'm a true believer in the system. And so I really believe that the way to prosperity as a country, whether it's jobs, whether it's improved health by citizens, whether it's treating patients with currently unmet medical needs, that the patent system is kind of the key to success. There's a lot of theoretical exercises that suggest you can get there in different ways, but the proven and most reliable and sustainable system to advance innovation and spur innovation is the patent system. So I'll start off with, I'm a true believer. The second point I'll add is my undergraduate background is in chemical engineering, and I'm a problem solver. And so when you see an issue come up and you recognize it's a problem, I've just always thought, well, how do we fix it? And if you see an issue in the law and you can't get a good diagnostic claim, well, what are we going to do about it? We got to fix it. And so, I've always had an interest in problem solving, and I think the problem solving nature of my character comes out. And the third item is, I think we have a duty. Rules of professional conduct, our duty as citizens, as our duties as attorneys, is such that if there's a problem in the law, that we need to recognize that and engage and try to improve the system so it's sustainable for the next generation.
Some of these patent policy developments, it takes a very long time and sometimes it's unpredictable. Do you somehow try to incorporate what you're learning about what you think might happen or is happening into your work, or have you found that's kind of like a risky game to play?
Well, in my view, it should influence how you draft cases, because if you're drafting a case today, it's not going to be enforced for, if it's a small molecule, it'll probably be 5 to 7 years out. If it's a bioproduct, maybe more like 10 or 12 years out before you'll start seeing much pressure on that patent in terms of how it'll be tested. So you do have to have a little bit of a crystal ball on where this is going. Some of the recently filed cases that I've been involved with the institution, we've started putting in basis for means plus function claims post-Amgen, because if that turns out to be workable as a means to get scope or a method to get reasonable scope around an invention, we want to make sure we have basis to do that. So you do have to start thinking about, how does this impact drafting? How do I want to position this case, not only to get through and comply with the statute today, but where the law may be going in the future. And some of those cases, may be test cases. Somebody's going to have to litigate that issue for the first time, and it may or may not be a Dana Farber case, but you have to kind of plan on it. It's one of the challenges of being a patent attorney, I think, is it's an evolving environment that we work in. And because of a 20-year term, you kind of have to think about, where is this going? Where are we going with this? How can I draft a diagnostic claim that will meet the statutory requirement, meet the guidelines in the office on how the office is applying 101, but also get through the court and where the court may be taking that issue. So it's very difficult, but I do think that the policy debate informs the practice, and it should, for practitioners to make them better.
So, for example, maybe even if a diagnostic patent might not withstand the federal circuit, it might still be worthwhile to obtain it today in case that gets fixed. By
the time it's litigated, who knows? Yeah. Who knows? I have my fingers crossed. At some point, somebody's going to fix the law, whether it's Congress or whether it's the court. Somebody's going to fix the law, because in my view, it's not good for society when diagnostic patents are so much at risk. It's just not good. And frankly, the lack of predictability in the current statute, where you can have subject matter that even a decade ago people have looked at and said, unquestionably, this is patent eligible subject matter, now be found ineligible. And with the innovation that's coming down the road, I mentioned diagnostics, but gene therapy and cellular therapy, putting that innovation at risk is really, really problematic. And so I do hope that somebody helps solve that problem. I hope to do my part in that discussion and debate, but at some point the federal circuit or Congress is going to have to step up and make a difference there.
So you're the chair of the IP section of ABA, which is one of the big organizations of IP attorneys. And I think you said it's a very rewarding experience doing that. But part of it is trying to kind of impact what happens on policy. And what I hear from the Hill, I guess, two things. One is, well, for organizations like that, and actually within these organizations, very hard to form consensus. And for example, Section 101, at one point, like ABA, IPO, APLA, they all had different positions on 101. And the people on the Hill are like, we don't need their positions on 101. We just need them to support what we're doing, or something along those lines. Are those problems, from your perspective, is there anything that could be done, or it is what it is, and kind of just that's how the ecosystem works, and we'll have to.
It is a problem, and it's a very difficult and challenging problem. In my view, that it's a little bit of how the system's supposed to work as well, though. I mean, I think it's good to have robust debate of different positions and try to find a consensus. I think where the 101 debate in particular is bogged down a bit is you have, I'm going to say, three camps, roughly. You have a camp that's very, very interested in fixing the problem, that they view the current 101 issues as being unsustainable to protect innovation in a number of different fields, but particularly the life sciences, 'cause at least that's the area I know best. You have another camp that thinks the 101 issues are very important because it gives an early kill strategy on an invalid patent, and the earlier and perhaps more predictable kill strategy on an invalid patent. And they worry about kind of giving up that quiver in their quarrel of arrows to attack a patent. And you have a third group that I think is being a little bit opportunistic, particularly around the life sciences, that just see it as a means to not have patents in that space. So, there are those that think patents in the diagnostic space are bad and net negative on the system. And I think they're just as happy not having any patents in that space because they think the system, society will prosper without it. And it's very difficult to reach a consensus, particularly with that third group, because if you don't want any patent at all, how do you reach a consensus on what's a reasonable way forward here? On the first two, I actually think there is a way forward, and both sides need to compromise, and both sides need to play the long game on what is the best way to find a path forward to resolve the 101 issues. And yet, if it's an invalid patent because it's too abstract, allow Section 112 to do the hard work to make that invalid. And I've studied a lot of these patents to try to understand them. And most of these patents that are being held invalid, not all, but most, or I should say many of them in the leading cases, would have been invalid under 112 if they just litigated that issue out. But the advantage of a quick kill under 101 it just made it more attractive.
So you and we discussed some of the patent policy debates going on around Section 101 and some of the administration's proposals as well, like the Martian rights and the proposal on fees. But, from my vantage point, outside of maybe when the AIA was set up or 101 section cases were coming out, there's been really a barrage of IP proposals from the administration as a whole, but in particular the USPTO office, guidance to the examiners and so forth, all with that goal, I think, of making life difficult for big pharma companies. At the same time, you see Director Vidal saying all the right things on even things like diagnostics and so forth, believing in innovation and so forth. What is going on? I guess you've been on the PPAC, you've been close to it all. What is the USPTO doing?
PTO has a very difficult job, and Director Vidal, in my opinion, is doing an excellent job in trying to navigate a number of challenging issues. I think the true north for the PTO is a reliable and durable patent right. So many of their initiatives are driven by and motivated by trying to get a more reliable and durable patent right, which I applaud and support entirely. The PTO also has an interest in making the patent system more accessible to the small inventor, to the entrepreneurs, to the constituencies that haven't engaged the patent system that are really critical to success for the country. The patent system should serve a broad spectrum of inventors and encourage inventors across the broad spectrum of geographies, diversities. So I think Director Vitale has also focused her energies on how do we make the system more accessible. At the same time, you have to recognize that not all patents are without challenge, that some patents go through the system are properly invalidated either at the PTAB or by district court. Now, the office should strive to make that number as small as possible. I mean, theoretically and ideally, you'd have every patent issued by the patent office be valid and enforceable, and the PTAB and the courts would not have much to do. But that's just not reality, that the examination process is inherently imperfect. And so there always will be patents that get through the system that need to be addressed in court or at the PTAB. And Director Vitale is trying to manage that so that that process can be as efficient as possible and as fair as possible across all spectrums. And so it's a very difficult issue, multivariable issue that she's trying to balance that I think it's just a remarkable job that she and Director Anku before her have really done a remarkable job in managing.
One of the last topics I want to talk to you is about you were on the Patent Public Advisory Committee. I think you're bound by some obligations with regards to that with confidentiality. The PPAC, for those who don't know, members of it are appointed by the USPTO directors, and they're supposed to theoretically represent different stakeholders within the patent system. Is there anything from being on the PPAC that surprised you about how the USPTO operates or how the government operates or how even the PPAC operates?
The first aha moment when I joined PPAC was just the level of commitment by the office from the director all the way down to get things right. It really is remarkable, the dedication that the office has to get things right and to try to do what's in the best interest of the public in terms of issuing a valid and durable property right, and trying to make that as affordable and efficient as possible. So I was really struck, and I came into it thinking that would be the case, but just to see it in committee meetings and see it come out as forcefully and as clearly as it did was really quite surprising to me. I think the PPAC plays a very important role at serving as a sounding board for the director. And I also think the PPAC plays a very important role in terms of kind of bringing a real world perspective. Having good diversity of thought on the PPAC from what the statute requires to have an independent inventor, but from small entity to large entity to from an academic research setting to a commercial research setting, pan-industry perspective, I think is really quite important because we provide a sounding board to the director on issues, particularly pre-notice of public comment and during the rulemaking process at the early stages when the office is being really quite deliberative. And that's the point of input that I think the PPAC can really make a difference. I think it's key to the success is how the director engages the role and uses that input and takes that input on board and obviously advances that input to the extent it moves forward for public hearings and broader input from the public. But I think at the deliberative stages, the PPAC plays a very important role. How it can be improved is the office is really quite gracious in terms of providing resources and support to the PPAC. I think formalizing that a bit may help. So if the PPAC wanted to get data to address an issue or to help inform an issue that today, other than any work that I may do personally on research to generate data or to identify data that might be informative, it's kind of on each PPAC member to do that with the resources they may have available to them. Where I think if the PPAC had resources, they could perhaps commission the collection of some data that might not otherwise be available. Now, I say that very hesitantly because the patent office is terrific in supporting data, and whenever I made queries to various resources within the office is on the availability of data, whether it's on pendency or quality or some of the other work that the OPQIA undertakes, they are always very forthcoming. So, but having resources to study more deeply some issues, I think would be helpful. But in general, I'm a proponent, not surprisingly, since I served as chair, that the PPAC plays a very important role.
So this is public for the fee proposals that we discussed. The PPAC had a report, made a lot of recommendations. I don't know if you'll agree with my characterization, but the USPTO put out their proposal on the fees, recognizing there were these recommendations, but basically doing whatever they were going to do anyways. And some people say, well, the PPAC is really just window dressing in that the USPTO doesn't feel bound to even follow some of the minor fee recommendations that were kind of provided.
Yeah, well, I mean, the role of the PPAC is advisory, and sometimes your advice is accepted, and sometimes your advice is not accepted. But I can't say with 100% certainty that the office is very deliberative, thinks about, takes on board, listens thoughtfully to the advice of the PPAC and its members. And so, in my view, that's all you can ask. There's room to debate on whether one point of debate is, do you use fees to encourage different behaviors? And I think part of the PPAC report you may be referring to was, the PPAC did not favor using fees to encourage or discourage certain behaviors, because the PPAC's rationale, and that is that those that have money and can afford it, you don't deter, and those that don't have money and can't afford it, you're really penalizing. So you're creating a hardship for the under-resourced population or group. That's a debatable point. I mean, that is. I can certainly see the other side of that issue. That hey, if you have to charge $500 for this, one, to reflect the cost at the office, but two, maybe people won't spend that $500. They'll do something else instead. Whether it's excess claims or excess whatever. I get that, and I get how the office could ultimately have a different view of that. So, our role was to provide advice. Sometimes the client doesn't listen to the advice, and sometimes they do. I think that's just part of it. But I can say with 100% confidence that it was very thoughtfully considered, and I respect the fact that they may have landed on a different side of the issue at the end of the day. But I appreciate and think it's very important that it was thoughtfully considered.
Another idea for the PPAC is, from what I understand, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, is that the PPAC members kind of work through the director's office and her staff, is about allowing the PPAC to be maybe a little more independent, be able to talk to anybody they want, especially if they work within the government or on the Hill and so forth, have freedom, maybe like you suggest, maybe their own staff within the USPTO that can gather data for them independently and so forth. Any thoughts about that, about providing a little more independence for the PPAC?
I never really experienced the front office or the leadership of the PTO limiting the freedom of the PPAC. So I don't know that more independence that it's necessary. At least I haven't seen the data to really suggest that that's a big problem to solve. Now, having said that, you certainly could see a circumstance where it could be. Some of these things are maybe better to plan ahead than be reactive, because you could see a circumstance where PPAC is not given that independent thought, or not allowed to provide that independent thought, if you will. So at the moment, I don't see that as a problem to be solved, and certainly wouldn't make my priority list. But it's not inconceivable for that to come about, and some of that could just reflect my time on the PPAC and my experience. The PPAC was there's a lot of independent thinkers. So to the extent as chair, I wanted to influence the PPAC as a whole, or the director. The director was going to get an earful from the PPAC members, whether it was Director Ancu or Director Vital, kind of whether they wanted it or not. And so I wasn't too concerned about that independence, because the PPAC members were more than happy to share their independent views. But I do think you could see perhaps it's planning ahead. And I think if we had to do it all over again, perhaps a little bit more independence would ensure that from a sustainability perspective, but I don't think it's a current problem to solve.
So thank you for sharing everything you did. Two final questions that I usually end with. Maybe there's a student somewhere at a university getting his graduate degree in biochemistry and realizes this isn't for him, and he's like, wow, Steve Caltrider's career path was really cool. How do I do that? What advice would you give him to be a successful?
I would say first, dream big. Second is have a degree of patience. And third would be to pivot along the way. Life's not going to play out exactly as planned. And I could look back at my career and it didn't play out as I thought it would. But at the same time, if you dream big, you're patient, and you're willing to pivot along the way, you can do great things in this field. And I would add, as part of patience is learn everything you can. Learn everything you can, because the reason to be patient is because you're laying the foundation to do bigger and better things. And if you skip that step, you may think you get where you want to go, but you may end up falling back a little bit. It's a great profession, great field. I look back and I was incredibly blessed and incredibly fortunate in my career with some good mentors, good friends and colleagues, great people to work with. And, I've loved it every step of it.
Before we finish, is there anything else, I guess, that you would like to tell the Clause 8 listeners about the IP world, the patent world, or the world in general?
If you don't mind me making a little bit of a shameless plug, on the policy side, I am the chair of the American Bar Association Intellectual Property Law section, and there's a Chair's Town Hall series called Building a Better Patent System, where I've identified six issues that I feel are just vexing and have been around a long time that we need to have the policy discussions and debate on how to solve them. And we've set up a series of webinars. We've held one now on transparent prior art and the public availability standard. The second one is coming up on inequitable conduct, but there's 6 of them. So I would love to invite you or any of your listeners to join us on those series, because they are really good town hall style sessions to discuss these vexing problems that I think are under the patent system's currently facing.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for joining Clause 8.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. New episodes of Clause 8 come out every 2 weeks, so be sure not to miss it by subscribing at clause8podcast.com or wherever you listen.